Early on in the story of the Jewish people in exile in Egypt, were they really in Golus, or were they living in the lap of luxury in Goshen, which may have even been their ancestral land? And what about us? Is Golus for us that difficult all of the time, or are we in control of the experience of Golus? Watch how the Rebbe takes Rashi's interpretation of words right at the end of Parashas Vayigash to give us a perspective not only on what happened historically, but what our focus in Golus should be. Here are the words. Al hatevis vayeachzu ba. The end of the parasha, the pasuk achron the parasha, and it's actually in the last pasuk of the parasha. It says, "Vayeshiv yisod beretz Mitzrayim beretz Goshen." The Jewish people lived in Mitzrayim, in the land of Goshen. Vayeachzu ba. We'll see what those words mean in a second. Vayifru vayirbu oid, and they multiplied greatly. Yeshna beis pirushim. There are two interpretations of what that expression vayeachzu ba means. Aleph pirush vayeachzu lefi pshata pasuk kamesha pirush Rashi. There's a simple explanation which Rashi gives us. L'shayin achuza, it's, so to speak, their land, their inheritance, their estate. Beis Pirush HaMedrash, then there's explanation of the Medrash, which obviously is not Pshat, which says, the Vayachzu ba means they were captured by the land, they were held by the land, like a person is being held against their will. In other words, the translation of the word is not from the word achuzah, which means like an estate, but achizah, which means to hold the land, is holding them. Now, the reason why Rashi in the Pshat interpretation does not want to say that the root of this word is to hold is because because the pasuk tells us straight after this that they multiplied. That sounds like they were already successful. That implies that the words Vayachzu illustrate how they lived in the land of Goshen. They lived in a way that led to them being highly successful and growing. Therefore, logically, according to the Pshat interpretation, the Midrash words don't work. That they were living there against their will. Well, it sounds like they were growing and succeeding. That doesn't sound like something which is against their will. When a person is in an environment against their will, they typically don't succeed and grow. Plus, the word itself doesn't lend itself to a translation of being from achiza to being held, which in the context of the Pshat would mean they held the land, because simple grammar tells us that can't be the interpretation. Then the pronunciation of the word would have been with a cholam, vayoichu, and they held the land. Not the way it's actually written, where the aleph is in a commas, which is a reflective verb, which means they were held by the land. So the pshat would not work with translating the word as achiza. But the issue is this. We've seen so many times that you always have multiple interpretations of a word aligning. The Rebbe said again and again, when there are various interpretations from our sages on a single word or a single concept, it's not that they're altogether different, but to the contrary. Seeing as they are interpretations of a single word, you have no choice but to say there must be a link between these interpretations, because they're all translating the same word. Now that doesn't seem to be the case, yeah. The two interpretations, Rashi and the Medrash that we have quoted, not only do they not appear to be linked, they appear to tell us opposite messages. When I go with Rashi's simple understanding of the pasuk, Rashi is saying, it's their land, it's their achuzah, it's their estate. Achuzah, they're totally in control. The Medrash is saying what appears to be the exact opposite. The Medrash is saying actually they're being held by the land against their will. So how could you have two opposite interpretations of the same phrase? So that will be understood by looking at what Rashi said a little earlier on in the pasuk, where Rashi's interpretation is a part of the pasuk that introduces whatever Vayigash is supposed to mean. What does Rashi tell us? Rashi says the pasuk tells us the Jews settled in Egypt. Says Rashi, Vehechon, and where in Egypt did they settle? Be'eretz Goshen, they settled in the territory of Goshen, Shehi me Eretz Mitzrayim, which belongs to Egypt. Wow, that sounds like a lot of words to tell us something that surely could have been said more simply. So the commentaries tell us, well, Rashi is saying this, there's a question you'll have on the language that the Torah uses. Be'eretz Mitzrayim, Be'eretz Goshen. Why use that expression? Tell us in Egypt, in Goshen. That sounds like they're two different territories. And therefore Rashi has to clarify for us, no, actually it's the same place. Where in Egypt did they live? In Eretz Goshen. So you have to interpret the pasuk as if the words went as follows. Be'eretz Mitzrayim, they settled in Egypt. Ve'heichon, where within Egypt? Be'eretz Goshen, in Goshen. That's what it sounds like according to the Mefarshim, but it raises three questions for us. Number one, after Rashi has told us, and where? In Goshen, why does he have to again tell us that Goshen belongs to Mitzrayim? Isn't that self-understood from the context? Vayeshev Yisrael be Eretz Mitzrayim, the pasuk said. The Jews settled in Egypt. And then Veheichon Eretz Goshen, you could qualify which province or which territory, Goshen. Why do you have to then again tell us, and Goshen is in Egypt, when the pasuk already said that? Question number 2, Beis. The pasuk also is difficult to understand. Why does the Torah have to tell us that they settled in Egypt and then say in Eretz Goshen, or Lefarish Be'eretz Goshen? Let the Torah just tell us they settled in Goshen. And we'll know that Goshen is in Egypt. Because the Torah in this parasha has already told us clearly that Goshen is a territory of Mitzrayim. Why do you have to explain it again? And lastly, Gimel Im Kavonos Rashi Rak Levoris Harichos Haloshim, because of Be'eretz Mitzrayim, Be'eretz Goshen. If the only thing bothering Rashi that he wants to clarify is why the Torah uses convoluted language to tell us in Egypt and in Goshen, don't think they're two separate places. They're actually the same. Why did Rashi, in his headline, include the words, and the Jews settled, which apparently he doesn't seem to be explaining? So what's Rashi doing for us? He's addressing a different issue altogether, about the status of what it is for Jews to be in Goshen. Rashi is addressing the fact that this pasuk seems to contradict something we have already previously learned quite a bit earlier in Bereshis. Where? In Parashas Lech Lecha, B'vris ben Abasarim Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu Avram, in the covenant that Hashem made with Avram Avinu. Back in Lech Lecha, he told him, Ki ger yezer acho b'aretz lo lahem gomer. Your children will be aliens in a land that is not their land. V'achrei chen yetzu gomer, and eventually they'll leave that land, and when they do so, it will be with great wealth. Hainu, in other words, the message of Avraham Avinu was Shekodim Knesses B'nei Yisrael Eretz Yisrael, before the Jews will settle eventually in the promised land Eretz Yisrael. Yuchrechu Lavor Matzav Shagolus, they will first have to go through a period of exile. Al Dei Sheyu Ger Goyim Be'eretz Leilahem, in which time they will be foreigners in a land that is not theirs. That's the message. That's the promise. That's what's supposed to be happening over here in Egypt. And in this pasuk, it does not seem to be happening. How then is it logical to say, how can the Jewish people fulfill this promise, which is foreigners, aliens in a land that isn't theirs? When the Torah is now telling us they were very settled in that land. A foreigner is not a settled person. Here it says, Vayeshev, and they settled in Egypt, from the word Toshav, which is a citizen. The opposite of a foreigner, which was what they're supposed to endure, being foreigners. This is what Rashi is bothered by. How did you say Vayeshev? That they settled in a land where they're not supposed to be settled. And not only did they settle in a land, the question is increased by the fact that it's Be'eretz Goshen. Where in Mitzrayim did they settle? Goshen, which Yosef has already clarified earlier, is the best part of Egypt. And the Torah is telling us over here that they have, so to speak, ownership or mastery over what becomes like their territory. It became their land. That does not sound like being a foreigner. You're living in the best part of the world in a settled way, and you own the land. That explains why Rashi's headline includes those words Vayeshev Yisrael, because Vayeshev Yisrael is part of the problem. Part of what's bothering Rashi is how could they be so settled in a place where they're supposed to be strangers and foreigners? The Torah addresses that question, and we only know this because Hamavur bepirish Rashi, because that's clarified in Rashi's interpretation. Because the Torah tells us Goshen is in Mitzrayim, or as Rashi says it, Shehi me'eretz Mitzrayim. Yes, Goshen is a lush place, but it is Egyptian. In other words, soif gameretz Goshen chelek meretz Mitzrayim ve'eino eretz Canaan. Whichever way you look at it, Goshen is not the promised land. It is very much Egypt. So if the Jews are in Goshen, comfortable as it might be, it's Golus, it's not where they belong. The fact that they're not in Israel, which is the land where they belong, they are strangers in a foreign land, which fulfills the promise to Avraham Avinu at the covenant. Okay, so sounds like a technicality, right? It's not yet absolutely clear, especially when you look through the lens of mysticism, of the deeper parts of Torah. Why was there a Golus? And is that goal being fulfilled by living in the lap of luxury in Goshen? The intention of Golus, of being in the Egyptian exile, was it was, as the expression goes, this cauldron that was supposed to refine the Jewish people so they would then emerge at a level where they deserve to not only leave, but to more importantly get the Torah and eventually go to Eretz Yisrael. Surely that refining process requires some discomfort, some feeling like an alien. If they are comfortable and feeling like owners of Goshen, how do they fulfill this particular requirement? And that question is an even more serious question when you look not from the pshat perspective, as Rashi has given us, but when you look from the drash perspective. What does that mean? Now that we have been told, at least according to Rashi, that the meaning behind the expression Vayochseba is that it was an achuzah, it was their ownership, their land, their territory, their estate. That sounds like Goshen remains Jewish land or Jewish owned, Jewish territory. That doesn't seem to make any sense. How could anybody suggest that a piece of Egyptian land is Jewish territory? Eretz Canaan Yerusha Livnei Yisrael. The land of Canaan, which subsequently becomes the Holy Land, that is the inheritance of the Jewish people. That's what Hashem promises Avram and subsequently Yitzchak and Yaakov. This is the land that will be the inheritance of your children. To the exclusion of Egypt. How could a piece of Egypt be considered achuzah, their land? Okay, but the truth is, if I'm staying just at the simple pshat level, this is not an earth-shattering question. Because being in Goshen is something that they did for 210 years of being slaves in Egypt. But if you're in a place for 2 centuries, it's not a stretch to say it's your territory. That's pshat. But when you look from the perspective of Drash, now you're looking at the deeper meaning. It's not a good enough answer just to say, well, you're there for a period of time. It's not considered your land. It's not considered your land because the Torah says clearly your achuzah, your Yerusha, is a different land altogether. Okay, so we'll try an attempt. Aradak b'Sefer Yeshua, maybe b'Shem Adrash. So the Radak, not here, but on Sefer Yeshua, tries to answer that, well, Goshen maybe did become Israeli territory at some point. or Jewish territory, better way to say it. Sha'amar Sham Yehoshua Kavash as Kol Eretz HaGoshen, when the pasuk in Sefer Yehoshua tells us that Yehoshua conquered a territory called Goshen, according to the Radak, that's Koyal Goshen Shel Eretz Mitzrayim. That's actually talking about this same biblical Goshen, which belongs to Eretz Mitzrayim. Which then became absorbed into Jewish cities. In other words, at some point in the future, it will become a Jewish part of the world. Because of Sham bein He'arim denachla Shevet Yehuda, and in Sefer Yehoshua, Goshen is listed as part of the territory that belongs to Shevet Yehuda. According to the Radak, that includes what was previously part of Egypt. The Goshen of Mitzrayim now becomes the Goshen of Israel. Okay? The So maybe with a little bit of a dray of the finger, we could now say that actually the expression here Vayochsuba is referring to the fact that later on it will become Jewish territory through the conquest of Yehoshua. That now we're considering Goshen a Jewish land, even though it's only going to happen formally in the future under Yehoshua's leadership. But it's actually a really difficult explanation. It's a real stretch to say that at a period in history when the Jewish people are living in Goshen, we're already going to name it or classify it as Jewish territory, based on an event that is lying in the future centuries later, when that land of Goshen will be absorbed into Israel because of Yehoshua's conquest. That's a really difficult explanation, that we're going to determine things now halachically based on future events far down in the future. Well, perhaps there's another angle for this. There's a different medrash that tells us that when Sarah Imenu, after having been captured by Paro, was then released with great wealth, part of that great wealth was that he signed off the land of Goshen to be hers, to be her territory. Which is why the Jews eventually landed up over there later on when they came down with the Yaakov family, because they now had an ancestral claim to this land. And then, of course, we could say, it is their achuzah, it is their land, because it's inherited land from Sarah Imenu, from an event that happened centuries earlier. A great answer, except it only strengthens our original question. If Goshen is Jewish territory, how's it Golos? How does it fulfill the deal that Hashem made with Avraham Avinu, that your children will be foreigners in a foreign land? It's not a foreign land. It's our ancestral land from Sarah. Well, if it's our inheritance from Sarah, we're not foreigners in a foreign land. We're at home in our own land. So the only way to answer this is to dig into the interpretation according to Chassidus. What was the Golus all about? And specifically, the details of the slavery that are described in the Torah are supposed to represent for us something that we could have mitigated through spiritual focus and intention. And maybe Goshen offered us an opportunity that we missed. The Alter Rebbe explains in Torah that all the details about what the slavery looked like in Mitzrayim, which are b'avodah kasha, hard work, b'chomer u'bilvenim, using the various materials, the cement and the bricks, kayomim gamba ifen ruchni, are all also represented in spiritual terms, be'isek HaTorah, in how we engage in proper learning of Torah. The Alter Rebbe quotes the Zohar that says, b'avodah kasha, that word, difficult work, Zaykusha, that's asking deep, challenging questions about what we learn. Bechomer, the material and cement that they used. Do kal v'chomer, that is the mental gymnastics of understanding how you extrapolate things based on the kal v'chomer principle. Or belevenim and bricks, do liben hilchas v'chulei, that is the clarifying of the correct halacha, which is what we call the bleaching of the facts to get the halacha. Libun and levenim are related words. In other words, says the Alter Rebbe, if a person schwitzes and works and really invests in Torah learning to the point that it's exertion, Then that person doesn't have to go through the pain of Golus in Egypt because they've experienced the pain of hard work in learning Torah. If you do it spiritually, you're exempt from experiencing it physically. Actually, this is something in Pirkei Avos too. K'maimer Mishnah, Kol HaMekabel Olav Oil Torah. The Torah says that anybody who accepts the yoke of Torah, and the words of they are very precise. V'adiuk bazehu oil Torah. Not just that you learn Torah like for leisure. You take on the yoke of Torah. Shemekabel al atzmai es ha'oil avodah kosher chum l'kolei hanal b'zer shel Torah. That means that a person accepts that they have to work their way with exertion through learning Torah, not just be satisfied. Oh, I learned it, I understand it, move on. The Mishnah promises that person will have removed from their life the yoke of the politics, the government, the leadership, in other words, Golus, and the yoke and difficulty, the exertion of trying to earn a living. So when a person exerts themselves in spiritual dedication to Torah, it mitigates various other types of exertion that are not so pleasurable. That is the key to understanding what's happening over here in Goshen. Goshen, even when the Jews were living in the comfort of Goshen, which is possibly an ancestral piece of land, still in that comfortable environment, the Jews experience what Golus is all about. How so? Spiritually. There was a Torah set up that Yaakov and his children established, a yeshiva system in Goshen. They exerted themselves in the spiritual challenge of learning Torah properly, which exempts a person from Golus. They could have gotten a ticket out of Egypt, a get out of jail free card. And that gives us another insight from the richer perspective of Pnimis HaTorah. Bebiru Pirish Rashi, in the words of Rashi, tells us on Vayiachsuba, L'shein Achusa. Rashi says Vayiachsuba is not that the land grabbed and held them, but rather they had mastery over the land. It became their estate. Bitkufa Harishena de Golus Mitzrayim, because here we're describing the first phase of their experience in Mitzrayim. When the Jewish people are now settling into this land, they obviously don't know where things are going to land up. At this time, there is no slavery, there is no physical exertion. Nobody's whipping them and getting them to schlep bricks. At this point, their experience is the exact opposite. They experience we're living in the best part of Mitzrayim. We're in our own land. Even the other people living around them acknowledge this is Goshen, it's Jewish territory, where they are free to choose how they behave, and they have no responsibility to conform to what Egypt wants. So where is the Golus in that? Well, the only exertion, so to speak, of Golus is working hard to learn Torah. But that still leaves us with a question. If the fact is that the land of Goshen is an inheritance the Jews got from Sarah Imenu, we still have the question, how could you ever consider this being aliens in a land that is not theirs, when legally the land is theirs? The explanation for that is as follows. Yes, it's true. Goshen belongs to the Jewish people because it's part of their ancestral heritage from Sarah. Still, it's land that belongs to them, but it's not like their land. Meaning, nothing is going to translate Goshen into the great spiritual experience of Israel, which has this incredible oversight from Hashem at all times. And therefore, that's considered being in exile, being strangers, being foreign, while they are in Eretz Goshen, even before things turn sour and they become real slaves. The Jews at that time still felt a sense of pain having to live in a place that doesn't have that special oversight of Hashem that Israel has. And therefore, even furthermore, this land is not their land, meaning to say it doesn't speak the language of spirituality that their land does. That's already being slaves, that's already being in pain, that's already being in Golus, because they don't feel comfortable in this uncomfortable environment. But that's only at the beginning of the process. Even though at that time they pretty much controlled the space and they did what they were supposed to and they exerted themselves in Torah learning, as good as they were spiritually in Goshen, it definitely was a step down for how they were in Israel. And because there was a spiritual decline by being in Goshen, that created the possibility of a worse decline into real Golus afterwards. Meaning as follows. After this gentle period passed, after, as we'll see in Parshas Vayechi, Yosef passes away, and everybody from that generation passes away. Well, when Yosef and co are no longer alive, there's a natural decline in their exertion of Torah learning. And they started to forget that living here is uncomfortable. They started to acclimatize to the land of Goshen. So now you're no longer exempting yourself from the pain of Golus through the pain of Torah. So what happens is they start to actually become slaves. And the pain was so great that each day was as if they had just arrived in Mitzrayim, been rethrown into this difficult experience. They forgot what Eretz Yisrael means to the Jewish people. They even forgot the significance of being in Goshen. And then the Jewish people start to feel the pain and the distaste of being in Golus. Rashi told us that up front. That's what Rashi emphasizes. The Jewish people settled in Mitzrayim. Where in Egypt? Beretz Goshen. They settled in Goshen. And then he tells us, Shehime Eretz Mitzrayim, even that wonderful place Goshen, it's still Egypt. Rashi's kind of giving us the timeline. Yes, in the beginning, the experience of being in Egypt, albeit Golus, was gentle. We're in Goshen. Things are good. It's our land. It's an ancestral heritage. We're all good. Says Rashi, they needed to know they're in Mitzrayim, even if it doesn't feel so oppressive. Rashi's telling us the fact that Jews are living in Goshen instead of Israel, that is a decline. That is being captured by Mitzrayim. And a phenomenal thing happens, that even though Goshen originally is the best land for them, it actually turns out into the worst land for them. It becomes part of Mitzrayim. It becomes where they live as slaves. As soon as the Jewish people did not completely utilize their opportunity to serve Hashem through exertion and thereby exempt themselves from their tzoros, as the pasuk says, that what happens when we become complacent and we become materialistic, we reject our connection to Hashem. As I be'eretz Goshen gufa, then in that same place Goshen, which becomes the domicile of the Jewish people throughout the whole of Golus, the place that originally was so achuzosam their home, becomes the place of their pain. That explains how you can have two opposite interpretations of one phrase in Torah. Now we understand that their so-called mastery over Goshen, that it becomes their land, is directly aligned with the purpose of Golus. Why are they thrown into Golus? Not to be punished. Even though the pshat, as we've pointed out, doesn't automatically tell us that they inherited the land. That was something we found in a midrash. It wasn't in the pshat. That they literally inherited the land from Sarah Imenu. But Rashi did hint to the fact. He calls it an achuzah. Achuzah is a phrase that actually does relate to inheritance, becomes my land. And then furthermore, as we've already illustrated, when we look at it from a slightly more esoteric perspective, which is hidden, embedded inside Rashi's interpretation, we get it. What do we get? The intention of putting the Jews into Galus Mitzrayim was the only reason Jews are in Galus Mitzrayim is only in order to be able to capture the potential holiness, the sparks of holiness that are buried inside Mitzrayim, and take them home. As we well know, that is the deeper meaning of the fact that they cleared out Egypt when they left. As the Gemara tells us, they made it like a granary that was empty of grain, or like a reservoir that doesn't have any fish left inside of it. That by being in Egypt through the course of the slavery, the Jewish people managed to extract every one of the holy sparks that had exploded into Mitzrayim and other places in the world. From the world of Toyu, highly intense, holy sparks that were embedded in Mitzrayim, they got them all, and therefore the place is now empty. And Rashi's already telling us that story. That's what Rashi says. Means it's their territory. They take it over. The purpose and intention behind the Golus of Mitzrayim is that the Jews should inherit the embedded holiness of Toyu that's scattered all over Mitzrayim. As the Friedrich Rebbe once said, how does Yerusha work amongst the nations of the world? It's similar to the pasuk that says, if the person doesn't have a son, these are in the Torah's laws of Yerusha. The next in line to inherit the person is the person's brother, paternal brother. The pasuk tells us Yaakov and Esav are brothers. Therefore, we, as the children of Yaakov, are in line halachically to inherit the sparks of Olam HaToyu. Olam HaToyu is Esav's domain. So Esav's not using and elevating those sparks of Toyu, so we get to extract them and take them back to the world of Kedusha. And that explains how you can have two seemingly opposite explanations of one phrase, and they're not actually opposite. As Rashi said, the simplest understanding of Vayigash is it's now their place, it's their domain, it's their stomping ground. Because if you read the story at a simplistic level, which is what Rashi wants to address, at the time those words are used, the beginning of the exile in Mitzrayim, the difficulty hasn't begun yet. The slavery hasn't begun yet in Parshas Vayigash. So we're in charge. We've got the place. We're using the place as we wish. All you see looking at the picture at this point in the story is the Jews have the upper hand. They have Goshen under their belt, and they're using it in the best way possible. But if you look a little deeper, which is what Medrash does, that digs beneath the surface, then the Medrash alerts us, hang on a second, it looks good, it looks like we're in control, and at the same time the land has grabbed us. That it's against our will that we're being held in this territory. Because as we've already mentioned, yes, good things are happening. Yes, the Jewish people have control of this territory. But the very fact that they're in Goshen is a decline for the Jewish people. And that decline has opened the possibility, which will manifest later, of being captured and enslaved in Mitzrayim. ממילא נמצא שבהלם ובפנימיס כבר הויסה הירידה לארץ גושן באופן שהארץ הויסה חזס בהם ותפסס אויסם שבעל כורחוי אוחז בו. Therefore the Midrash is telling us, you know what's actually happening? The land is actually grabbing them now and will later drag them down. The two are happening in tandem. והטעמה והכוונה הפנימיס להכרח שמינין ויאחזו בו לפי פירוש המדרש שהארץ הויסה חזס כולי אויסם. Why, from a deeper perspective, is the Midrash insistent that the land has to have this hold over them? That Rashi already alluded to. In the deeper layers that Rashi embeds in his commentary, he's already alluded to this. That word achuzah, in addition to telling us that they have this power and this control and it's their land, also alludes to the fact that the land has them. Why? Because if the land didn't have that control, if they didn't get sucked into the Golos of Mitzrayim, they would not have had the opportunity to release the Nitzitzis of Kedusha that are hidden within Mitzrayim. Now that they were schlepped into the Golos and they became Avodim, they did access those Nitzitzis and they did elevate them, which was the purpose. And then they leave with tremendous wealth. Of course, there's much that we can interpret from that to understanding our role in Golos, and in Mitzvah Hashem, our success in being able to go Berechush Gadol to greet Mashiach Tzidkenu B'Karev Mamash.